The truth about the person you love's ex finally came out. Find out the matter secret they had been hid. Something was left behind in a message nobody was supposed to read. It was only a few lines. No dramatic confession. No angry confrontation. Just a name, a date, and one sentence that made the person you love go completely still. Their eyes stayed on the screen longer than they should have. Then they locked the phone, looked across the room, and took a slow breath. As if they had just discovered that a part of their own past had been rewritten without their knowledge. And that past had one name attached to it, their ex. For a long time, you may have assumed you understood what happened between them. Maybe you heard the usual version. They fell apart. Things changed. They moved on. The relationship ended, and eventually your person found their way toward you. Simple enough. Except something about that story never quite added up. There was always a missing detail. A conversation that stopped too quickly. A question that made them uncomfortable. A moment when their expression changed whenever their ex was mentioned. You noticed it, even if you never said anything. But now, something has surfaced that could explain all of it. The strange part is that the truth isn't what you expected. Because the secret wasn't simply about what the ex did. It was about what your person believed for all these years. And why they were never given the complete story. Imagine opening a drawer you haven't touched in years and finding an envelope tucked beneath old photographs. The handwriting is familiar. The date is from a time when everything in their life looked completely different. And inside that envelope is information that changes the meaning of a memory they thought they understood. That's where this story begins. Someone from the past has finally spoken. Not loudly. Not publicly. Quietly. And what they revealed has forced your person to look back at one particular moment with completely different eyes. There was a reason their relationship ended the way it did. A reason certain questions were never answered. A reason your person may have carried a small piece of doubt long after they moved forward. They didn't know whether they had made the right decision back then. They only knew that something felt unfinished. Then came the unexpected message. At first, your person didn't want to respond. They stared at the notification, wondering why the past was suddenly knocking again after so much silence. But eventually, curiosity won. They opened it. The first sentence was ordinary. The second made their heart sink. And the third revealed a detail so specific that there was no way it could be dismissed as coincidence. Your person realized the ex had been holding on to information for a very long time. And here's the detail you need to understand: this revelation wasn't necessarily about getting someone back. It wasn't about reopening an old romance. It was about finally understanding what really happened, and why your person became the person they are today. Because sometimes the past doesn't return to reclaim someone. Sometimes it returns to explain why they were meant to leave it behind. But the message contained one more detail. A detail connected to the moment your person first began pulling away from that relationship. And once they read it, they finally understood why the ex had disappeared without giving the full explanation. And why that missing truth may have been connected to you all along. There was one thing your person noticed immediately after reading that message: the date. They read it twice. Then a third time. Because it wasn't from the end of their relationship. It was from months before everything fell apart. A period they remembered completely differently. Back then, they had believed their ex was simply becoming distant. Conversations had become shorter. Plans had mysteriously changed. Certain questions were met with vague answers. And whenever your person tried to understand what was happening, they were told not to overthink it. Now, that old explanation didn't seem convincing anymore. The message revealed that something important had been happening behind the scenes during that exact period. Someone had known something. Someone had made a choice. And your person's ex had apparently kept the information hidden because they believed revealing it would create consequences they weren't ready to face. But there was an even more surprising part: the secret wasn't about another romance. It wasn't about betrayal in the way your person had imagined. It was connected to a decision that had quietly changed the direction of both their lives. Your person sat there in silence, replaying old conversations in their mind. One sentence suddenly sounded different. One awkward goodbye suddenly made sense. One unexplained change suddenly had a reason. And that's when the emotional weight of the revelation began to sink in. For years, your person may have blamed themselves for certain things. Maybe they wondered whether they had been too trusting, too emotional, or simply not enough. But now they were discovering that they had been making judgments without having all the information. The story they carried wasn't completely theirs. Part of it had been shaped by what somebody chose not to tell them. Stay close to this part, because what happened next makes the entire situation more meaningful. Your person didn't immediately confront the ex. Instead, they asked one simple question. "Why didn't you tell me?" The response took several minutes. Then the typing indicator appeared. Stopped. Appeared again. Stopped once more. Finally, a message arrived. It explained that the ex had been afraid that telling the truth would make your person stay when they needed to leave. At the time, they believed they were protecting them by keeping certain information to themselves. But protection built on silence can create confusion for years. And now, the ex was admitting that the decision had consequences they never expected. Your person lowered the phone. For the first time, they weren't angry. They were relieved. Because the truth finally gave a name to something they had never been able to explain. And while they were sitting there processing everything, another realization began forming. They thought about you. They thought about the way you had entered their life without demanding that they forget their past. You didn't ask them to prove anything. You didn't force answers. You simply showed up differently. Patiently. Consistently. And suddenly, your person understood something they hadn't been ready to understand before. Their previous relationship hadn't only ended. It had prepared them to recognize what a healthier connection could feel like. If this story is already making you think about someone in your own life, you can quietly share it with someone who might understand. And if you want to follow where this revelation leads, stay with the story, because the next piece of information is the one your person never expected to receive. It came from the ex. And it wasn't an apology. It was a confession about the very first moment they realized your person was going to meet someone who would change everything. The confession arrived at the exact moment your person thought there was nothing left to uncover. They almost didn't open it. The screen lit up on the table, displaying another message from the ex, and for several seconds your person simply watched it sit there. The room was quiet. No music. No conversation. Just that small notification glowing against the darkness. Then they finally tapped the screen. The message began with a sentence that changed the entire tone of the conversation. "I knew before you did." Your person frowned. Knew what? They kept reading. The ex explained that long before the relationship finally ended, they had noticed a change in your person. Not a change in affection, but a change in perspective. Your person had started questioning what they actually wanted from love. They had started noticing the difference between being attached to someone and genuinely feeling understood by them. At first, the ex thought it was temporary. They assumed the relationship could be repaired if they tried harder. But then something happened that the ex never forgot. Your person talked about the kind of person they hoped they would meet someday. Someone patient. Someone who wouldn't make them feel like they had to constantly prove their worth. Someone who could sit beside them in silence without making that silence uncomfortable. At the time, your person didn't know they were describing you. But the ex remembered. And suddenly, an old conversation that had seemed meaningless became incredibly important. Your person put the phone down and stared into space. Because they remembered that conversation too. They just hadn't realized what it meant. This was the part that made the revelation feel almost surreal. Your person had believed their journey toward you began much later, when you actually met. But according to the ex, the emotional shift had started much earlier. The relationship they were leaving had already taught them what they could no longer accept. It had already shown them which patterns exhausted them and which qualities they desperately needed in their next chapter. And then came the detail that made your person's expression change completely. The ex admitted they had once seen your person receive a message from someone they didn't recognize. They didn't know who it was at the time. They only remembered your person's reaction. A small smile. Nothing dramatic. Just a smile that looked completely different from the one they had been seeing lately. The ex said they knew, in that moment, that something had changed. But they never asked. They kept that memory buried. Until now. Your person read that sentence again and again. Because they knew exactly which message it had been. It was from you. A simple message. Nothing romantic. Nothing that seemed important enough to become part of anyone's history. Yet somehow, that tiny moment had been noticed. Remember this detail, because it explains why the truth about the ex matters so much. The secret isn't simply exposing something hidden in the past. It's revealing how many small moments were quietly moving your person toward a different future while they were still trying to understand their present. And the ex had one final thing to say. They admitted there was another reason they stayed silent. They had been afraid that if your person discovered the truth too early, they would make a decision out of guilt instead of love. That sentence stopped your person cold. Because suddenly, the entire past looked different. Maybe the ending wasn't a failure. Maybe it was a necessary turning point. And maybe the person your person eventually chose wasn't random at all. But there was still one unanswered question. If the ex had known your person was moving towards someone new, why did they wait this long to reveal everything? The answer was already sitting inside the next message. And once your person opened it, they discovered the one piece of the story the ex had kept hidden from everyone, even themselves. The message that came next wasn't long, but your person read it so slowly that every sentence seemed to carry its own weight. I wasn't protecting myself, the ex finally admitted. I was protecting the version of the story I wanted everyone to believe. Your person stopped. For the first time, the mystery wasn't about what happened between them. It was about why the truth had been shaped differently for so long. The ex explained that after the relationship ended, they had told friends and family a simplified version of events. It was easier that way. They could say the relationship had simply run its course. They could avoid uncomfortable questions. They could move forward without explaining the decisions they had made behind closed doors. But there was one thing they couldn't erase. They knew they had deliberately kept an important truth from your person. And now, years later, that truth was finally being placed in front of them. Your person kept scrolling. Then they saw the sentence that made everything suddenly connect. The ex had received an opportunity that could have changed their future together, but accepting it meant leaving your person behind. Not because they didn't care. Because they had already decided what they wanted their own life to become. That was the secret. The ex had been planning a major change long before your person knew about it. They had considered moving, changing careers, and starting over somewhere completely different. They had even begun making arrangements quietly. But instead of having an honest conversation, they slowly created distance, believing that if the relationship naturally became weaker, leaving would hurt less. It didn't. It only created unanswered questions. And your person had spent years carrying those questions as if they were evidence that something was wrong with them. Now they finally understood. The silence hadn't been proof that they weren't loved. It had been proof that two people had been standing at different crossroads. Your person leaned back and closed their eyes. Then something unexpected happened. They started thinking about you, not with fear, not with comparison, but with gratitude. Because you had never asked them to compete with their past. You never demanded that they become someone else. You had simply met them where they were. And perhaps that was why this revelation felt so powerful. The truth about the ex wasn't pulling your person backward. It was showing them why they were finally capable of moving forward without carrying an old question on their shoulders. There's a detail here that deserves your attention. The ex admitted that one of the hardest parts wasn't losing the relationship. It was realizing, much later, that your person had become happier after letting go. Not immediately. Not perfectly. But gradually. The laughter returned. The confidence returned. The lightness returned. And then you appeared. The ex said they noticed the difference. They could hear it in your person's voice. They could see it in the way they talked about their future. And that realization forced them to accept something they had avoided for a long time. Sometimes loving someone means accepting that their best chapter may begin after yours has ended. If you've been following this story and it reminds you of someone, feel free to share it with someone who might need to hear this perspective. And if you want to stay with us, there's still one unanswered question waiting beneath everything we've uncovered. Because the ex hadn't revealed the secret merely to clear their conscience. They had another reason for finally speaking. And that reason had nothing to do with the past. It had everything to do with what they had recently discovered about your person. And about you. The next message arrived the following morning, and this time your person didn't open it immediately. They saw the ex's name on the screen and felt something different. Not fear, not anger, but a strange sense that whatever came next might finally close a chapter that had been left open for too long. They picked up the phone, read the first few words, and then stopped breathing for a moment. The ex had recently spoken to someone who knew both of them. That person had asked a simple question: "Do you know they're serious about this?" The ex didn't understand what they meant at first. Then the person mentioned you. And suddenly, the ex realized that your relationship with your person wasn't a temporary chapter. It wasn't a distraction from the past. It wasn't something that would disappear when old memories resurfaced. Your person had genuinely moved forward. That discovery was what finally pushed the ex to tell the truth. Because they realized that if they stayed silent any longer, your person might continue carrying an old misunderstanding into a future that no longer belonged to the past. The ex didn't want to become a shadow over something that was finally becoming real. So they revealed the one detail they had avoided for years: the decision that ended their relationship had never been caused by your person being unworthy of love. The ex had already made a private choice about their own future, and instead of being honest enough to explain it, they had allowed your person to believe they were somehow the problem. Your person read that confession twice. Then something inside them became quiet. Not empty. Free. For years, there had been a tiny question hiding underneath everything: what did I do wrong? Now that question finally had an answer. Nothing. They hadn't failed. They hadn't been impossible to love. They hadn't lost someone because they weren't enough. Two people had simply wanted different futures, and one of them hadn't been brave enough to say it clearly. But there was still another surprise. The ex told your person that they had seen something recently that made them realize just how different your relationship was. It wasn't a photograph. It wasn't a public announcement. It wasn't some grand romantic gesture. It was the way your person talked about ordinary life with you. The small plans. The everyday conversations. The future details most people overlook. Where you might live. What you might build together. What kind of weekends you wanted. What made you laugh. The ex said that was when they finally understood the difference. With them, your person had been trying to make a relationship survive. With you, your person was imagining a life. That distinction landed harder than any dramatic confession could have. Your person looked at your name in their contacts and smiled. Because suddenly, all those little moments between you carried more meaning. The conversations that seemed ordinary. The times you listened when they expected judgment. The moments when you stayed calm instead of turning everything into an argument. The way you made space for their dreams without asking them to abandon their own. None of those things had felt extraordinary while they were happening. But together, they had created something the past couldn't compete with. And now your person had to make one final decision. Not about the ex. About you. Because knowing the truth was one thing. Choosing what to do with that truth was something else entirely. And before the day ended, your person made a decision that the ex never expected. They reached for their phone, opened your conversation, and began typing. The first words your person typed weren't romantic at all. They were simple. "Can we talk?" They stared at the message for several seconds before sending it. Then the familiar silence of waiting began. No dramatic music. No sudden interruption. Just a phone resting in their hand while their thoughts moved faster than they could organize them. When your reply finally appeared, something softened in their expression. They didn't tell you everything immediately. Instead, they asked you to meet. There was something they needed to say face to face. Later that evening, the two of you sat together somewhere quiet, away from distractions and everything that had happened during the day. Your person looked at you differently. Not because you had changed, but because they had. They were no longer looking at you through the unfinished story of their past. They were looking at you as someone they had consciously chosen. Then they began talking. They told you that something from their past had finally come to light. They explained that their ex had admitted to keeping important information hidden, and for the first time, your person understood why that old relationship had ended the way it did. You listened. You